After the overwhelming response and support for our Game Boy Color with the analog stick, we decided it was time to build a Game Boy Advance with the analog stick. However, this time it was going to be a little bit different. We took the feedback from our viewers, and this time we were putting an aftermarket analog stick into a Game Boy Advance. This analog control stick can be purchased off AliExpress for a couple of dollars and is compatible with the GameCube and PS2 consoles. Upon planning, we noticed that the analog stick was a little too high for the Game Boy Advance shell, so modifications were required to ensure that it would fit. The first steps involved to ensure that the analog stick fit into the Game Boy Advance shell was to trim the 4 support pins and bend the pentalobe meter pins. We also noticed that inside the Game Boy Advance shell, where the directional button once fit, the inner lip must be trimmed to ensure that we had a couple more extra millimeters of playroom. Next, we focus our attention on the electronic component of the build. The analog stick was glued and stuck down, and basic electronics were soldered. We found that there were 2 options to create this mod, one using a dip circuit and surface mount resistors, while the other was just using generic resistors from your local electronics store. In this case, we felt that option 2 was more viable and available for the public. For under $1 at your local electronics store, you can purchase this pack of 10K resistors. The resistors then have to be soldered off in series as pictured, and the end of the resistor has to be soldered to the positive terminal at SC2 on the motherboard. Then use some double-sided tape to hold it in place and to avoid any shorts. The next part of the build involves soldering the ground points. The pin marked clearly G and D is the ground point on the motherboard. Then the 2 middle points on each pentalobe are the ground points on the controller. Next, we need to solder to the directional points on the Game Boy Advance motherboard. These are TP4, 5, 6 and 7. A wire must come from these to the ends of each resistor. We've attached the image in the upper right hand corner as a reference for the directional solder points to make it easier. Once soldered, your Game Boy Advance console should look something like this. Our next focus is on the remaining 4 solder points on the Game Boy analog stick itself. The points on the right of the thumbstick are the up and down directions, and the points at the bottom are the left and right. It's now time to create the last solder points as a circuit loop. These points now must be soldered between the original solder point and the end of the resistor as pictured. If we've lost you part of the way through this process, we've attached a copy of the schematic to make things easier for future modding. Now it's time for a quick test before modifying the front half of the shell. To gain a few extra millimeters of clearance space, we had to machine the upper lip of the inside of the directional button key. To ensure a flush finish, we also had to trim around the edges of the directional key. After test fitting the analog stick, it appears to sit flush with the front of the faceplate. After testing both the GameCube and PS2 analog thumbsticks, we felt that the PS2 stick was the best option, as it also sat a little higher than the GameCube thumb and made it easier to control and maneuver. The overall finish of the console looks clean and factory. The analog stick feels like the original GameCube and PS2 controller. It was quite enjoyable creating this mod and knowing that an authentic analog stick feel could be input into a Game Boy Advance console itself. We endeavour that this will be a popular mod in the future with Game Boy Advance fanatics, and talented modders such as Natalie the Nerd, Cypher or Froggo Customs will create a more simplified version of this stick for more modders to enjoy. After using the directional key for many years on the Game Boy Advance, we must admit that it does take a little getting used to playing with the analog stick on a Game Boy console. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to check out our others, and also like and subscribe to our YouTube channel.